work with the hand in the beginning is to work with a one-to-one so that you're actually using your hand to basically trace out the clay that we'll be using in the form. And that just is because we have a model with us today, and it will be here for us to look at in different positions. So this is the easiest way to kind of start understanding the anatomy of the hand. So what I do is I start with a block of clay, and I try to think about the width of the hand this way, and then we will kind of roll out the slab a little bit or throw it out. And this is the most difficult part. So what I want to do is kind of just throw the slab so that the platelets in this clay start lining up together. If you have a slab roller, that works too. I tend to like to work with it with hand. Otherwise, you have to roll it through one way, this way through the slab roller, and then roll it through another way so that those platelets will line up, especially if you're using clay right out of the bag and you haven't wedged it. So I kind of check to see if my hand will fit on the little slab of clay that we have. And then I also again check kind of the height of this clay in comparison to my hand. And then we simply just trace onto the slab of clay and then simply cut that out. So now that we have the slab, everything's connected, which makes it easier for me, and I've found for students as well, that you don't have to add these coils of clay to the hand, because any of you who have tried to put fingers on, especially when you're working with a smaller size, know that those continually fall off. The digits just will find a way to fall off. What we do now that we have this slab of clay, I want to put this away because we'll be using this to embellish it later, is we basically put our hand to the side and we look at the shape of the finger and how thick it is compared to how thin it is, and we try to just repeat that in the slab that we already have. So if my finger is this width here, then I'm going to basically take off this much clay. And then the thicker it gets as it comes down my hand, I'm simply going to remove that clay body so that it's closer to what my hand looks like. And if you can, if you can pinch your hand and it's very thin, then you want to be also able to do that to the piece that you're sculpting. So you're going to take out that clay the best you can. So that's all I'm doing, is I'm kind of looking at the profile of my fingers and trying to replicate that on this portion of slab that we have rolled out and cut. And then it gets more complicated as you go to the different fingers, but you can still kind of do that. And if you mess up, you simply add more clay or take more clay away. And I start with the fingers and then I go to the palm of the hand. Again, this is just a way to become familiar with the anatomy of the hand without learning all of the correct terminology. We're basically looking for landmarks and trying to figure out, the proportions by visually looking at it. The more you know about the internal structures of the hands, the muscles, the bone structure, the way that the hand moves, what happens when fingers bend, so on and so forth, the more successful you'll be with getting it to look like your actual hand. So here it is much thicker, so I'm going to leave the thickness here, and I'm going to carve away some of this, just trying to get the basic shape of the hand at this point. Again, if you cut too much away, it's not a problem. We're not working with wood, so you can simply add more clay back. But now you can see I'm starting to get kind of the palm structure of the hand. A lot of times I will draw in landmarks and lines so that I can kind of reference those as I cut away or add to a piece of clay. Again, we have our model here. Suggested you use your weak hand as your model. Then once you graduate from your weak hand, you can use your strong hand. So you can see here how I've just kind of basically started working with the palm of the hand. And now I can begin to think about the back side of the hand, where the bony structures are, the relationship of, what joints are close to the endings. The pinky is typically here at the joint of your ring finger, and the thumb here to the pointer finger. All hands are different, so proportions change, but you just will navigate your way through this structure by using your hand. So I'm going to mark where my knuckles are. And then where those joints are. And then make those lines apparent so that those again become landmarks that I can look at. The knuckles, just think of it as tracing or using this hand in a way that you can reference it. So the thumb a lot of times ends up being difficult because you'll notice that it's not flat on your hand. It wants to turn, depending on age, and how your hands have gone through this life, if they've been injured or they've worked extremely hard. Knuckles and arthritis and things like that will change the anatomy somewhat. So you want to be able to look at these pieces of information because the thumb is turned to the side somewhat. And so I'm going to check the angles with my tool and kind of work with that because my thumb does point out. Also, you need to think about the tools that you're using. I prefer a wooden tool that has a small wire cutting surface on it. Some people prefer, these wider surface tools. I found that I can get really fine detail with these, and I can also cut away a lot of clay with them as well. The wood releases the clay quite well. It doesn't get stuck to it, and I can utilize this just like I would utilize my finger in sculpting something, but it's smaller and it can get into more places than my finger can get. So a tool needs to be something that you think about as an extension of your finger, simply because the smaller we work, and as we go through this I will show you how to take something large and reduce it, but you need to be able to utilize a tool so that it will do the work for you. So if I can roll a tool over my finger and take it around, I should be able to do the same thing on my clay. So muscle memory is a wonderful thing. You can utilize your fingers as well on something this large, but it is more difficult the smaller we get. If you'll notice how the ridge comes up here in the center, I'm going to also do that with my clay finger. I'm going to bring that up and flatten this out some. So basically I'm just drawing in space, and I'm using my tool kind of like an artist would use a pencil or a drawing utensil. Just taking off those hard edges. Again, I'm working on one side of the hand at this point. Landmarks, okay? Checking angles and planes, which way they move about. Again, we're going to be thinning this area out because it's thin here. Also, people don't normally think about it, but if you look at your hand, many of us have webbing between the fingers. So you want to create that webbing starting at the base of the fingers. And this is another reason I don't like to add those sausages on for fingers, because it simply a lot of times just falls off while you're going through this process. So again, I'm just thinking about how my tool comes up between those fingers, keeping in mind where those joints are. My joints being older and have been worked, in a lot of different areas, have become enlarged. So I'm going to be thinking about how this relates to this. So here, here. And then the end of the finger goes down. And we'll deal with the fingernails here later. Now we'll work on the palm, doing basically the same thing we've been doing, just looking, referencing. A lot of times people are like, it just doesn't look like a hand. And one of the reasons it doesn't look like a hand is because you're not looking at your hand to make the reference. So you're just recreating what's in your mind's eye of what a hand looks like, and you're not really referencing what's right in front of you. So if you're having difficulty, just continue to look at it and play with that structure. I'm going to go ahead and mark these lines on the back or the palm of the hand as well. Again, that thumb wants to turn on us, but we need to be able to sculpt that in that format too. So if your thumb is this angle, it needs to be this angle here as well. So I'm simply going to round this edge into those particular planes. And the knuckle, when it's laying down, is basically coming from underneath. And this is just the first sketch, okay? At this point, you don't want to overwork the clay. We're just trying to get the feel of the hand, the gesture of the hand. And if you overwork it at this point, it's going to dry out and start to become too difficult to work with. We just want to quickly get these landmarks on the surface of the clay, denoting the joints, the palm where it is depressed in and comes back out. You can move clay, and bring it back over. I work with clay extremely soft because I like to move it around. I just feel that it has a better feel or quality to it, that there's more life involved in it if I don't overwork it at this point. If you're trying to depict a certain person's hand, you really do need to reference that hand. And one thing that I suggest you do when you're trying to sculpt an individual or a specific hand gesture, that you set your model up and you take pictures all the way around 360 that you take from different angles. And if it's going to be in a certain position, then you hold it in that position and take those photographs from every angle available, because then you can reference, if the pinky finger has been broke, there's going to be certain angles that are different from the typical hand. So those are just things that you would want to consider if you're trying to sculpt a specific gesture or a specific hand feature. So you can see now we kind of basically have the makings of a hand just in a very short amount of time. You just work a few more things on this and start thinking about the gesture or the pose we want of the hand. At this point, I would start adding clay to the hand. Let me just set this on a pillow Old pillows are wonderful tools to have. So now I'm just going to lay in these little balls of clay to denote these knuckles here. And because my hand's older, these are very defined. Basketball didn't help, but again, you need to understand what you're sculpting and what it looks like. You can also reference things. If the hand is closed, these will be more pronounced, whereas they're open, they almost lose themselves in the back of the hand. I go ahead and add them, and then I can take away what I don't need. Also, some people's thumb, this joint is very pronounced. So you need to think about that as being a really defined angle here. Right now it looks very much kind of, like a Gumby hand. So we need to think about adding that particular joint there as well. At this point, we're probably ready to set it up on an armature. And an armature is just a tool that we use to hold something in position. Some artists, when they're building life size, will have these armatures actually built around pieces to hold them in place. For something this size, I take something as simple as a piece of plywood and a nail and simply stick the form on it. We might have to add some clay here to create the base or the wrist. So, when you're thinking about, proportion and size, you can think about that here, but we really need something that's substantial enough to support this. So we're simply going to take this. Because the clay is so wet, we really don't need to slip and score. We can simply just kind of open up that clay body to attach the two. If your clay is a little bit drier, you would simply add water or vinegar or a slip to that and simply press the two forms together and then sculpt up into it. Again, working with soft clay is really a nice thing to do. And this will give us something to attach to the armature. You really want to make sure that things are attached. Sometimes I think people are afraid, oh, I've done all this work and I don't want to mess that up. But if it's not attached, then after you've done all that work to it, it's not going to be around for you to work on. It's just going to disappear and you'll have to redo it anyway. So now we have a good base. Our hand's looking kind of dilapidated at this point, but that's okay. And that's something you need to see because your hand isn't going to be there yet. It has to evolve into this form we're making. What I suggest is you get it to this point, work on, kind of the form of the hand, that you can see it wants to slouch. At this point, it's important to let your clay rest. And what you want to do is get it to this point and perhaps work on something else. I'm working usually on 2 to 3 pieces at a time in my studio so that when I get something to a point that it's time to let it rest, I can just set it aside and work on something else. If I don't, again, this clay is going to keep doing what it wants to do, not what I want it to do, so I'll spend 3 times the amount on the piece that I need to because I'll have to keep redoing it. So let's just get it in the position that we think we want it to be. You can see that I need to add pads to the fingers. Not everyone has these pads, mine does, so I'll just kind of come and again add a little ball of clay to that. Again, think about the angles that entails. And just putting those little pads on, and we can come back and refine those later. Now this part of the hand right here is still really flat, okay? It's vacant of this muscle here or this tissue. So we need to add that to it. Right now it's just too thin. So we're going to add that muscle tissue there. again, just by adding pads of clay to it. So think about this, the relationship, the landmarks, it's kind of at the top of this V here. You can think about your own hand, the size of that muscle, and then putting it right into that space. Okay, that muscle comes back at an angle, so I'll take my tool and then just simply, again, start running that tool toward the back of my hand. And now you can tell that there's mass here that wasn't there before. That thumb's pitiful, isn't it? Again, don't get, too obsessive about it. But I'm going to add some clay here that I can carve away later. So you can tell how that has been built up. Let's go to this side now and think about, again, there's a lot of muscle missing here. And if it's missing, you just simply need to add it. It's very round in this area. A lot of times if you'll just draw that onto the surface of the clay, you can then just fill that in. So I'm just kind of forming that muscle that lays right there, that goes up into this joint right here. It comes back towards this side of the hand, so I just simply take my tool we're getting there. So now we're going to add this muscle here. Again, the outside of that hand, that muscle is very sturdy and strong, so we're going to add it here because right now it's not there. Also, if you'll look at this line is critical to how the shape of this hand is going to look. Okay, so if it goes that angle here, it's going to go that angle there on my piece. Okay, so you can see where I've drawn some detail in there that I can now come back and fill in the clay. So I'm going to look at this first and just follow that line that I drew and pull it back toward the center of this hand. And then I'm going to think about this muscle here. Put it on the outside of that hand and pull it in on those lines that I drew. And that's a little severe right there. It kind of goes up and then out just slightly. So I'm just going to add just a little bit more. There's my nail. So we can cover that up because I do need some more tissue here. I'll simply just roll a coil and follow this line here. And as you work, you'll figure these things out. There's no set in stone rule that says you have to do it in this order. I kind of just work at it in the same order each time, simply because I've done hundreds of these, and you'll get better at it as you maneuver the clay and figure out where your landmarks are, what your structures are. The hand, I think, and the foot as well, are two of the most critical pieces of information that we leave out as figurative artists, especially in those beginning stages of learning to work with a figure. And if you think about it, especially creative people or expressive people, people that have been through some type of trauma, the hands, the feet, they relate all of those types of emotions. And so if your piece is about a certain thought or feeling or action, the hand and the foot needs to relate to that. Otherwise, you're missing that piece of information. And it, I think as instructors, a lot of times we get straight to the body and we forget, or we run out of time and we don't think about these pieces of information that, to me, in a piece, allow us to express things that if we didn't really contemplate them would be lost in the work that you're doing. So to me, the hands are probably one of the most expressive parts of the figure. This is a good time to talk a little bit about proportion. The hand does cover the face of your figure. My hands tend to cover more than the face because I choose to use the hand and make it a little out of proportion, making it larger so that those expressions that the hand is creating really resonate with the viewer. And if the hand is smaller, that means another thing. But you as the artist have to choose that. You have to choose what are the important parts of information that you're going to give your viewer. So now that we've added some more mass to the hand, there are some pieces that are still missing. You know, the back of the hand, it's not so much that that part of the hand is thicker, but the way we tend to rest our hand, the angles come up and then go back down. So depending on what this hand will eventually do, we may do that in the final stages. But at this point, I'm not going to add all that information because we haven't decided what form we want this hand to take. And if you keep the clay soft enough, you can simply mold it into that shape and then rethink about, you know, how the structure changes within that form. So basically now we're going to stop with this portion because it needs to be covered and left to do its thing. The moisture, you know, needs to move from the clay bodies that we've added to it into the main body of the form. You know, those of you who bake bread know that you have to let it rest or it just doesn't do its thing properly, and I'm, you know, convinced that clay also needs time to rest and to kind of understand what it's doing. Different clay bodies react differently. The way I'm using this particular clay body, because it has a lot of grog in it, because it's very wet at this point, I'm just slapping the clay on. Whereas if you're working with porcelain or you're working with clay bodies that don't have as much grog or have more memory, then you will need to put together your form the way that those clay bodies hold together. I've been using this particular clay body for 15 years now, and so I know a lot of the attributes that it has, what it can do, what it doesn't like to do. But I do choose this clay body because it doesn't have a lot of memory. I can do this, and then I can go back to here and not worry about it when it fires going into a weird position because at one point it held that position. So that's what I mean by memory. So we're going to set this off to the side and let it kind of percolate or rest. So at this point we've let the hand rest, and I tend to quickly sketch them out like what we have just completed and let that set in a plastic bag overnight and then utilize it the next day. So once it has had time to sit and the clay bodies kind of integrate into the existing clay body, the moisture exchange has kind of happened and they've stiffened up a little bit, we can do a lot more with it. It won't be flopping over on us, and we can choose a hand position in which we want this to remain. So at this point, I have a hand that has the knuckles delineated, the different segments, you know, delineated. We have some muscle structure here and here and here that we can start working with. And I will show you, you know, if you want to refine it to the point of adding fingernails, how that, you know, can be done, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to continue to just let the hand be in a relaxed position, and then we will shape it as we need to and put it into position. All right. So it's stiffer, it's not leather hard. You don't want it to be leather hard until it's in the position that you want to have it. So I'm going to start with the thumb. And again, just kind of look at the positions, look at how much clay needs to be added or taken away. And I'll also be sculpting with a brush at this point, off and on, because a lot can be done with brushes. You can use soft bristle brushes for finer detail. You can use stiffer bristle brushes to actually move clay. You know, in various sizes will also come in handy. if you're depicting a particular hand, you would want to have that as your model, using those photographs, using anatomical books to look at structure, understanding the underneath structure of the hand, what's under the skin. It is always useful information, and the more that you can study that, the more you'll understand ways to manipulate it and create something that is far stronger and can hold more potential for you. So I'm just going to start adding coils and looking at these planes that are on the structure of my hand and just trying to replicate those in this. Okay. Widen this a little bit and turn this to this position here. So you see why it's important that this be a little bit stiffer. It now holds its position a lot better. And now it's where you can start refining this. So I need to add some clay here and clay here. This is simply vinegar put into a squirt bottle. Some people like magic water, which there's a recipe online for that. I like inexpensive vinegar. Some people like more expensive vinegars like balsamic. This is an inexpensive way to create something to add on to your clay at any stage. I've been loading things in the kiln, bone dry, and popped a finger off and simply taken the vinegar, reconstituted both sides of the piece, put it back on, and then put it in the kiln and fired it. So you can see how I'm starting to define these planes. The more you can define those planes, the less your fingers will look like hot dogs. Okay. And I over-angulate everything because I can soften it up in the end. I like to really kind of stick with these planes. My work is more dramatic and more theatrical, so any type of expression I can get out of the hand is going to be beneficial to my work. Just going to add kind of where the fingernail is going to go, just to create that bed. And again, there's lots of small planes and angles even around these very small details. Okay, we're going to let that one stay for a while, and we're going to just continue to move through the hand. Again, think about this portion of the hand and simply the angles. A lot of times if you open this thumb out, double check it, you can kind of just sculpt with it right in front of you. You can also see, depending on how the hand is held, where these lines will lead you. Again, work quickly. We're just still at the kind of the stage where we're getting all the information here, then we can come back and refine it. Again, this is just vinegar. Just adding some coils to get that mass built back up. So again, I'm just creating these nail beds right here. With my smaller hands, I rarely have this type of definition. but the larger you go, the more detail often you may want. So what I'm doing is I'm checking the curvature of these nails, and then I'm just rolling that tool just like I rolled it over my nail, okay, so you can see. And then we can come back and define the shapes of those later. When you look at a nail, this is called the red manicure. This tissue here is not flat. It curves over and back around. There's also tissue here underneath that nail that comes kind of, it's plump under there. So we need to be able to build these structures around this bed, and then we can come back and lay a nail in there. So that's what I'm going to do here. All you need to do is take a coil, and they have to be rather small. I'm going to lay one around the end of where the nail is going to go, kind of back up around. That, and then bring it back into this, but you can tell that this is higher, and a lot of times they just blend right in. Again, it depends on how much detail you want. You know, this may be way overstated for the work that you're doing. This is just information that can be utilized at a later time when you need it. And this is going to look quite deformed when you do this, but remember, we're going to lay that nail in later. So now that we kind of have those beds laid in, we can start thinking again about how we want these to be positioned. Again, I really am interested in making these joints very evident, to get away from just that kind of really stylized, or not even stylized, the fingers that just look like hot dogs glued onto the end of your arm. So I really spend a lot of time at this point defining all of those. So I'm just going to work for a while and take some of this down. You can see it's so much easier to work at this stage of the clay. It's not leather hard, but it's quite carvable, and you can manipulate it so much easier than when it's wet. And then here in a minute we'll put it back on the armature so that we're not destroying everything we create. I find it's easier to bulk the piece up and then come back and carve it, the detail out later. Some people like to use very minimal clay, but I tend to be someone who builds it up quickly and then comes back and carves out the final details. So now, you know, I'm ready to really start defining. I have the mass of the hand, I have the mass of the fingers, and now I can put it back on my armature to continue to work on it. At this stage, if I was working with a life-size piece, very shortly after this, I would go ahead and connect the hand to the arm. But since this is basically a learning tool for us to look at, we'll just continue to work with the hand on the armature. I have lots of spare parts around my studio where I've done lots of studies, and I've taken cast of hands and feet, and you'll see that later in the foot demo. But it's very critical, I think, as an artist to have these references of different positions, different hand types around the studio so that you can quickly pull them in and look at them if you're having difficulty on a particular piece that you're working on, or you just need a little bit more information. So now I'm just going to work on refining this and then come back and finish it up with brushwork. A lot of times the fingers seem too short, okay? And it's because we forget that this detail down in here is actually read as part of the finger. This is part of the finger, but because this webbing is here, a lot of times we don't really look at that when we're sculpting. So a lot of times I'll just take this front information out and leave the back information there. That's what I'm going to be doing right now, is simply looking at how much of that webbing is actually still part of this movable finger. So I can literally put it on my piece and trace that webbing down so that I realize that, or I can just visualize it. So I'm just going to quickly take all of these down kind of at the same angle and then really kind of play with it. And you can make this just as thin as your skin. The clay will, you know, hold that structure for you. It's sturdier than you think. So again, we're just going to look at the structure here. This is really important information, and it's often not considered, but it should be considered for someone who's wanting more realism in their work, to think about these things. What I do is simply roll out coils and lay them in, and then brush over them to capture that padding, that webbing in there. And the more the hand is together, the more that culminates in these areas. So we're going to look at this coil first, okay? And it starts at the base of the thumb and it runs into, you'll notice this line runs into where this middle finger comes down. So we'll simply stop the coil there and kind of blend it in. We're going to blend down. There's a little bit more here, so we'll add a secondary coil. And again, it just kind of follows this course here. And that angle, you want to keep that angle. All right, so we'll do some brush work and then we'll put a fingernail on. And we'll just take a brush, follow those lines. I mean, and sometimes I leave those and sometimes I totally obliterate them at the end. It just depends on what kind of surface that these are. But yeah, a lot of artists will finish the final piece, Brancusi and a lot of those guys. The final touches, you kind of add the skin with a brush or some kind of like scrubby pad, or I've even seen broom straw used. Everybody kind of has their own kind of finish that they put on that. It's kind of a signature of sorts. All right, so to make your fingernail, so we're basically gonna give this guy a manicure, and if you want, you can lay it on your nail. I think I'm gonna make some clay ones and wear them to a party. Again, you're checking that slight arch there. So I'm just connecting that to the finger. I'm gonna simply follow that down around that original nail bed that we made. And then you just continue to play with it until it fits what you want. And I have been known to get my sculptures manicures once they come out of the kiln and use regular fingernail polish, including, you know, clear, red, whatever, you know, fits your fancy. But the clear polish is a great surface to put on both fingernails and eyes as well, eyeballs, to put the gloss on the surface of the clay if you want to control that gloss. Other people use epoxies. They'll mix epoxies and paint those on the surface. Really, because we're not being functional potters here, we're allowed to do any surface that we want. So you can see there needs to be some refinement here, but that will give you the basic idea of how the nail fits into the bed that we created earlier. Actually, it looks better than mine. So let's just go ahead and think about finishing up using a brush, finding those areas that you want to refine, thinking about, you know, again, this is too thick in here. You can literally pinch this off or carve it off. And a lot of times you need to live with these pieces a while before you see everything that needs to be refined with them. So don't be afraid to cover it up at this point, set it off, and then come back to it with fresh eyes. Because if you don't, you're going to miss some details that you need. And when this nail stiffens up, I can make it almost as thin as my own nail. I can just keep coming in here and cutting that down until it resembles very much a fingernail. Right now it's pretty clunky. So at this point you would just continue to define the hand, to redefine it, to work with surface, to work with gesture, you know, thinking about what it is you want the hand to do, what type of gesture it needs to have, the pose. You know, working with fist, you really do want to start with more of a ball type structure rather than how we traced out the hand, because to get all of this into that fist and the grip and all of these muscles, it's really hard to start from a flat hand and going in. So when I'm doing a fist, I basically trace my fist onto the slab of clay rather than starting with the flat stencil that we used earlier. So you would just continue to play with this until the structure of the hand is what you want.